Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Stephen Pimpare, host of the Public Policy Channel, and today we are joined by Keith E. Whittington, who is the author of You Can't Teach That: The Battle Over University Classrooms from Polity Press. And I never know whether that's You Can't Teach That or You Can't Teach That. Keith, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I wonder if you might tell folks just a little bit about who you are and what you do and how you came to write this book.
Sure. So I'm now the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School. And I'm the faculty director of a new center here, the Center for Academic Freedom and Free Speech. And so I'm spending increasing portions of my time talking about free speech and academic freedom issues. Before I came to Yale, I spent about 27 years, I suppose, in the political science department at Princeton University. So that's where most of my career has been. I was trained as a political scientist. That's where my PhD is. And I do generally constitutional law and history and politics type topics. And over the last several years, I've increasingly found myself pulled into the world of thinking about campus free speech in particular, and academic freedom. Maybe even more particularly, I sort of began thinking about student speech issues and speech issues around college campuses, which was sort of a natural extension of some of my teaching interests and other interests, but a lot of my scholarly research relative to the Constitution and law is focused more on structural issues, presidential powers, and that kind of thing. And so the First Amendment was sort of part of my teaching, but not necessarily part of my writing. But the last several years, it seemed like campus free speech issues have been so salient in our world. And it turns out it felt like there were things that I both could contribute to that discussion and should. And then the last few years, I've been spending more and more time focused on academic freedom, which is something I sort of took for granted and didn't think that I needed to spend a lot of time talking and writing about, but over the last few years, does not seem like something one should take for granted. And so something I'm instead spending a lot of time talking and writing about. And the book project is part of that. It focuses specifically on classroom speech by faculty and the freedom to teach more generally, and tries to think about that in a broad context, but also tries to think about how it ties into the First Amendment, what kinds of constitutional limitations there might be, as it particularly applies to thinking about professors in public universities and their ability to engage in teaching without worrying about interventions from state legislatures and others outside the university.
So why don't we start there, just for folks who may
Yeah.
not be fully familiar with what it is that you're talking about. What are those threats in the current moment that you identify and you think we should be most paying attention to?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I think on the academic freedom side, there are threats from lots of different directions. And so one of the things that's, I think, really challenging in the present moment is just how wide-ranging the kinds of pressures are, and also what kinds of new, both conceptual and constitutional and legal challenges they pose for universities. So I think there are some real pressures on universities from inside the campus community. And a lot of those tend to come from the political left, although the targets are not always faculty and students on the political right. That is to say, we often have faculty and activists who are on campus who tend to be to left, who are often patrolling the speech of people somewhat to their right, but that often means people on the center left. and so we've seen lots of instances of faculty who are getting in hot water inside their university campuses as a consequence of speech that, relative to the larger political arena, is regarded as sort of left-wing speech, but is is nonetheless politically controversial inside of university campuses. And we see that play out in various ways. We see calls upon universities to sanction faculty and even fire faculty for things they've said in public or things they say in the classroom, or even, and likewise, we see fights, which are more conceptually complicated, relating to retraction of journal articles and suppression of research and the like, as opposed to simply calling on people to be fired or punished by their universities. In addition, and this is a little more recent, I think, but is much greater scale, which is we're seeing political attacks from the right. And these attacks are mostly coming from off campus in their initial sources. They are mostly targeting speech that is on the left, whether it's sort of center left speech or more extreme speech on the left. These are driven by activists and politicians who are off campus, who are upset by speech that they tend to see on campus. And we've seen this for several years in the form of activist pressure campaigns on university campuses, especially surrounding social media. And so as faculty have made their opinions more transparent and visible to a larger world as a consequence of being able to post on social media, we've also seen the emergence of sort of a conservative infrastructure designed to identify that kind of controversial speech and publicize it and to mobilize critiques of it. That often takes the form of putting pressure on universities to punish faculty as a consequence of that kind of speech. This has been transformed in just the last few years into getting politicians more and more involved in trying to patrol and suppress speech on university campuses. And increasingly through the form of legislation. And so we've seen lots of state legislatures in particular begin to think about adopting new laws designed to restrict speech on college campuses. The most prominent of these is Florida's Stop Woke Act, adopted very early in the Biden administration, modeled a bit on an executive order that occurred very late in the Trump administration. The Stop Woke Act had a variety of components to it, but I think the one that's most important for this purpose is that it prohibits faculty in a state university classroom in Florida from advocating or promoting a certain set of what are called divisive concepts, sometimes characterized as components of critical race theory. So these are sometimes referred to as anti-critical race theory bills as well. And in addition, there's a second component of the statute that takes those same concepts and says not only can you not promote them, but you also can't compel students to believe them. That statute is currently enjoined in federal courts, and there's ongoing litigation as to whether that's compliant with the First Amendment. We've seen subsequent bills, and in some cases legislation emerging in other states that have borrowed pieces of that statute or modified versions of that statute as well. And so we're seeing really sort of this rise of a whole new set of attacks on universities that are really focused on professor classroom speech, in particular right now, at least in public universities. So part of what the book is concerned with is to try to think through conceptually and historically this freedom of teaching in public universities and private universities in the United States generally, and then turn its attention specifically to thinking about this case of professors in public universities and what kinds of First Amendment protections might supplement traditional academic freedom protections in that particular context.
So why don't we do just a little bit of that history? This is arguably not new, right? I mean, anyone who's done any reading on the Red Scare and the efforts to regulate speech in universities that resulted in people losing their jobs often, right? So we've seen this before. Tell us a little bit about what of that history you think is relevant. And then maybe for folks who may not familiar, tell us a little bit about the 1940 AAUP statement and sort of how we
Right.
start to develop this notion of academic freedom.
Yeah, of course, not new at all. And in some sense, this is traditionally what we would have expected in universities. And so part of what the book wants to do is really start with that earlier history of American universities and the evolution of academic freedom protections in the United States. Why did we develop in the first place? What were the kinds of controversies that generated them? What was the scope of them? Before we turn our attention to thinking about, okay, what are the current threats and why are they distinctive or not so distinctive compared to those earlier threats? And through much of American history, which is to say, from, say, the colonial period when great universities like Yale and Princeton and Harvard were first being established, up through the sort of post-Civil War, late 19th century, there was very little academic freedom protection in American universities, either private universities or public universities. The expectation was that university officials, like university presidents and board of trustees overseeing public universities, were supposed to be monitoring what professors were teaching in their classrooms and making sure that what they were teaching was orthodox as understood by the trustees in particular. And professors were routinely fired for teaching the wrong things or for saying the wrong things in public in general, and had no expectation, no rights not to be fired under those kinds of circumstances. What changes in the late 19th century and continuing into the early 20th century is partially a transformation about how we think about universities at all in the United States. That is to say, universities, as they were first being founded in the United States, were primarily places to train ministers. And if the job of the university is primarily to train ministers, although it did some other educational functions as well, but if your job is primarily to train ministers and you're appointed to board of trustees of a university dedicated to that mission, you would think that an important feature of your job as a member of the board of trustees is to make sure that ministers are being trained correctly, which is in part to say that they're not being trained in heresies, they're being trained in orthodox beliefs. Well, part of what happens in the latter part of the 19th century is you get a bunch of new universities being established in the United States. They're not dedicated to that particular mission. Instead, they have an entirely new conception of what their mission is. So you get private universities like the University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins and Stanford and Vanderbilt. They're all being built in the late 19th century after the Civil War. And likewise, you get the rise of public land grant universities being built as state universities after the Civil War. And all those universities are being built on a very different foundation, that they understand their core mission as being one of advancing the state of human knowledge and promulgating what we know, that they expect their faculty to be operating on the cutting edge of hard questions about both the natural world and the social world, and to be engaging with students on those highly contested and controversial issues. And eventually places like Princeton, Harvard, and Yale come around and adopt that mission as well. And so they transform themselves into sort of modern research universities of the type we know. Well, part of what comes along with that mission, at least faculty argued, that is, if you're going to be dedicated to trying to work on the outer frontiers of human knowledge and trying to expand those outward, then you need to protect the faculty to be able to ask very controversial questions and potentially come to very controversial conclusions about those kinds of questions. So you need academic freedom, and you need it in their scholarship, and you need it in their teaching. So that professors can help guide students to think about those hard questions that might be very disconcerting to the powers that be, whether we think the powers that be are parents, or alums, or donors to universities, or politicians, or community members more generally. Sometimes those powers that be can be the students themselves, and there are plenty of instances in the 19th and early 20th century where the students were the ones who were deeply offended by things that faculty were saying, and then the students were the ones leading the charge to get professors fired. So in response to that, we get the creation of the American Association of University Professors, in particular in the early 20th century, trying to import notions of academic freedom, particularly from Germany, into the United States in order to provide some greater security for faculty who might ask those controversial questions. And the big jump forward comes in the 1940 Statement on Academic Freedom. This is a statement that's issued by the AUP, but jointly with an association of universities. So they get university presidents to sign off on this statement. It reduces down what had been a 1915 declaration of principles that the AAP articulated that really sort of gave life to this idea of academic freedom. But the 1940 statement shrinks that down to a set of policies and says, okay, if you believe in academic freedom, we're not going to explain why you ought to believe in academic freedom, why it's important. Go back to 1915 if you want to see the rationale. What we're going to tell you in 1914 is here are the core rules and commitments you ought to have in place if your university is going to be serious about these things. And that document proves extraordinarily successful. Universities across the country wind up adopting it. Universities of all types, public and private, religious and secular, research and liberal arts, all wind up adopting versions of those 1940 commitments that protect faculty to engage in teaching so they can teach controversial subjects to their students and controversial topics and materials to their students without fear of being fired. It protects them in their freedom of research so they can engage in their scholarly work without fear of censorship or being fired by their universities for engaging in it. And then somewhat more controversially includes a third component, which I think properly construed is probably not really academic freedom per se, but is better understood as free speech, which is protection of faculty to be able to speak as citizens, which is how the 1940 statement characterized it. That is, you can go out in public and talk about matters of public concern without fear of discipline from your university employer. Of course, what they're thinking about in the early 20th century are things like newspaper op-eds or speaking at a public rally and the like. You're not necessarily speaking about your expertise, which is why it was quite controversial among early academic freedom advocates as to why should we particularly care to protect faculty if they're just expressing their personal political views. They're disconnected from their scholarly research or expertise in any fashion. But ultimately, AUP comes around the view that this, in fact, becomes critical to be able to protect faculty engaging in that kind of speech. And that's the kind of protection that covers things like social media posts and the like today, or as we've seen in the last semester, professors who are on the quad of a campus engaging in a public protest about political activities in general, protected by that same prong of thinking about what kinds of free speech protections we're concerned with. What the book is concerned with, though, is to focus on that freedom of teaching, that one prong of the 1940 statement, and the ways in which that ultimately gets embedded not only in university policies, but also gets connected to the First Amendment. So in response to the rise of loyalty oaths and domestic security regulations of the Cold War period in the 1950s and 1960s, you get litigation that gets in front of the courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, not only about universities, but also about K through 12 teachers to some degree and other kinds of government employees about what kinds of constitutional protections do government employees enjoy for having, for example, radical political views, and can they simply be fired for having those views? And the traditional constitutional answer was yes. The government can fire people on the basis of their private views. They can't necessarily throw them in jail for it if those are First Amendment protected views, but you can be fired from your government job for having First Amendment protected but controversial views if your government employer thinks it's contrary to the best interest of the employer, to the government agency you're working on. And the court carves back on that in the 1960s, and in particular in the context of university professors, it suggests there, after quite a bit of false starts, eventually comes to the conclusion that says, look, there's a First Amendment interest in academic freedom. And as a consequence, there's some constitutional protection for some kinds of academic freedom principles more generally. And then the court doesn't tell us much more than that. And so then it leaves it to the lower courts to figure out what the details of that looks like, which is sort of where we are now. That the court in the 1960s says there is this First Amendment interest in academic freedom. The lower courts are sort of left to their own devices to try to draw out the implications of that. And then things like the Stop Woke Act run headlong against those commitments. And so part of what's at stake in this current litigation and these debates surrounding this is how meaningful is that academic freedom protection that the court says exist in the Constitution, and what kinds of things does it cover? And the answers to that are not easy to work out. They're not obvious from existing doctrine. So just as a legal matter, it's not as clear as a lot of professors might like it to be about what kind of protections might exist. And moreover, I think conceptually, it's hard to think through what the doctrinal framework ought to be that both will protect what we really care about with academic freedom, and allowing for free inquiry in scholarship in the classrooms, while also not creating all kinds of problems that will result in courts trying to micromanage what happens in universities, which courts don't want and universities don't want, and probably faculty don't really want either. And so the book in part is trying to both talk through that history, explain why it matters, and then also try to think through, okay, what are these principles and how do they work?
So let's do some of that. So you argue that, in fact, that speech should be protected. In fact, even right, we're sort of talking about public employees here, not private employees of private universities, because that's a separate kettle of fish.
Yeah.
But that speech should be protected, even though that they are government employees, with some boundaries drawn around that, some sort of buckets we should think of to what qualifies as protected and what doesn't. So walk us through your thinking on how we should be thinking about what falls into protected categories and what maybe is less protected.
Yeah, so I think as you say, the private universities, I think, are a different kettle of fish. And so if the state legislatures, for example, or Congress wanted to regulate what kinds of faculty speech occurs in private universities, they're going to run up against a fairly robust set of constitutional concerns that I think are going to put any kind of legislation that looks like that into a difficult situation. On the other hand, if state legislatures want to regulate what's happening on public university campuses, state university campuses, including in the classroom, much less clear what the existing legal restrictions are surrounding it, that kind of intervention. And Florida has, the state of Florida, in its arguments in the federal courts, has put this quite starkly. And I think in a way that we have to take very seriously if we're academic freedom advocates or professors thinking about this, which is to say that Florida says, look, these are state universities. They're created by the state to serve certain functions the state wants them to serve. It must be the case that the government can supervise what happens in those state agencies and, if necessary, direct them and rein them in various kinds of ways. And that there are all kinds of extreme cases we might imagine in which we would say it would be very tricky to think that the university has authority to be completely autonomous from the state in this perspective. So, for example, if you had a bunch of Nazis who successfully infiltrated and took over a university, and the university was just spending all of its time teaching Nazism as the best doctrine, and students were showing up for their chemistry classes and the like, and what they were getting is Nazi indoctrination all day long in their chemistry classes, not to mention their philosophy and political science classes. We would not be surprised that state politicians would look at that state university and say something's gone terribly, terribly wrong, and moreover, we have the authority to intervene, right? And so then the challenge is, okay, well, if we think that in a case like that, the university has some authority to intervene, what's the scope of that authority, and where the lines can be drawn? And this is what constitutional law is all about, fundamentally, is trying to think about that line drawing exercise. Where's the line that can be drawn that says, well, you may be able to regulate some extreme examples, but not more modest examples, and what do those kinds of things look like? So in the context of our immediate debates surrounding these anti-critical race theory bills and the like, the concern of the state legislatures is to say there's some very specific ideas that we don't want discussed or advocated in our university classrooms because we think they are politically subversive and divisive in various kinds of ways. And we think, in fact, they're racist, and that they, in some context, and that they are contrary to core values the state holds. So then the question is, okay, if we think there's some kind of First Amendment interest in professors, even at public universities, being able to teach their subjects without outside intervention, what does that look like, and how far can professors push back against state legislatures to say, we're going to give you freedom in lots of contexts and to do lots of controversial things, but there's some ideas we just want to take off the table and say you can't teach in our public university classrooms? Part of what I want to argue, and borrowing from how we've thought about academic freedom as a matter of professional norms and as policymaking that we've developed in the higher education environment in general, I said that those can be tools that can be layered into how the court thinks about constructing doctrine in this regard. And in particular, what we've said in an academic freedom context more generally through the AUP and others who are sort of trying to think through how to interpret these university commitments to say you can teach controversial things in your classroom is we also say, though, that the controversial things you teach in your classroom, one, have to be germane to the content of the class you're supposed to be teaching. So if you're a chemistry professor, you're supposed to be teaching chemistry in the classroom. And so instead, if you dedicate half your class that's supposed to be teaching introductory chemistry to talking about the presidential election and how you feel about it and how the students ought to behave relative to the candidates in it, that's a problem. And the universities can properly step in and say, no, you've been employed to teach chemistry, not to share your political opinions in the classroom. And you can't take advantage of this captive audience of students to harangue them about politics when what they're paying tuition dollars for is chemistry. So we have a germaneness requirement that says you're supposed to stick to the content of the class you're teaching. But within that content, you should be able to introduce all kinds of controversial ideas that are relevant to the content of the class. We don't want universities micromanaging what the specifics of your chemistry class look like. But they do have an interest in saying you got to stick to chemistry, at least. And of course, things get more complicated if you move out of chemistry.
Just to pick up on that example, right? I mean, I can
Yeah.
imagine a set of circumstances in which you're in a chemistry class, but it's, October of 2024, and you're talking about different approaches to funding for the NSF from different administrations and what that might mean for funding for chemistry research, right? That could, quite clearly be germane. So context really can matter pretty profoundly.
Context matters profoundly in these things. And moreover, the context is not always going to be terribly clear. Sometimes it's going to be factually disputed, but also there's lots of gray areas where you can imagine. And even in the context of natural sciences, it's not as clean as one might hope that it would be, right? And so it's easiest in lots of ways to talk about these in natural science context because we sort of have this image on our head about chemistry and there's sort of hard boundaries and so germaneness is a little easier to see. But as you say, you can imagine contexts in which part of what you're doing in a particular class in the hard sciences is talking about NSF funding, for example, and how it works and what the boundaries of it are. There was a case not too long ago in Texas in which a professor was speaking to a medical school, and she is a science and health teacher and was partially talking about public health issues. And among the things she was told the class, she was a guest lecturer in this particular class, although she has an appointment in a different university. But part of the thing she told the class is that some of the public health policies being advanced by certain politicians in the state of Texas were misguided and wrong. And here's the reasons why I think this policy is wrong and whatnot. This got up to the relevant state politicians who were very unhappy to imagine there's a professor in a state university classroom criticizing their policy proposals and called for her to be investigated and, if necessary, fired as a consequence of that. And so I think the proper context there was precisely, I think, that this professor was, in fact, engaging in speech that was germane to the particular subject matter that she was dealing with and the particular content of the class she was dealing with. It may have been controversial. The politicians might not have been happy with it, but it was germane. And the germaneness is critical in that regard. And, that's not always easy to determine, especially if you only have a snippet of information. So, for example, we have this case happened just the other day of a Kansas instructor at the University of Kansas who teaches health sports. And there's a snippet of video from his classroom that went viral in which he is talking about, what he actually says is if people who refuse to vote for Kamala Harris for president, I'll be lined up and shot. So we might think it's particularly strong rhetoric. But if we're approaching that, I think the question becomes, why is he talking about it in this class and what's the context here? It's hard to know from the particular clip involved, for example, was this before class and he's just chatting with students, or is this actually something that happened in the class? It's hard to know whether this is in any fashion germane to the content of the class. But we also might think germaneness is not just a function of subject matter content of the class. This doesn't sound like health sports, and so presumably is not tightly connected to the content of the class. But we also, I think, have to make space, and we're thinking about germaneness, to take into account professors building rapport with students, they make jokes, they have asides, all the kinds of things that happen as part of the conversation you engage in class. I think professors have to be very cautious about how they do that, especially if the jokes they're telling are sort of going to be ones that are controversial and the like, and so you can easily drift too far. But I think we have to think about germaneness both in terms of something that is subject matter relevant, but also educationally relevant in that sort of broader sense of this is part of our teaching style. And so I think not to defend this Kansas professor necessarily, but I think the right way of thinking about what the issue is not is what he said controversial, or even is the rhetoric particularly violent, which is what the Kansas University officials have emphasized. But instead to say, why is he doing this in this class? What's the context here? Is there any kind of appropriate educational justification for what he's doing? And if not, then he's got a problem. But if it can be educationally justified, even if people might be taken aback by it, especially if they're looking at a short video clip, then that ought to be protected in lots of contexts. So that's sort of the germaneness issue.
Who gets to decide?
Well, that's, I think, part of what's really tricky about this in general. And so part of what's going to be relevant if you're thinking about constitutionalizing this, and there's going to be First Amendment protections here, is ultimately judges are going to decide. And so that's the potential downside from professor, right? From a professor's
As a
perspective,
professor myself, that doesn't sound good.
Right. So from a traditional academic freedom protection, right, part of what the argument of the AUP and others have emphasized is this ought to be a decision for the faculty to decide fundamentally, right? And so we're trying to make these determinations about, is this controversial material you're introducing in the classroom germane to the class? That's best answered by others who know about the class. They know about teaching, so they understand about what it means to be teaching in a classroom. They know about the subject matter. And you shouldn't go ask amateurs in the Board of Trustees, for example, as to do they think it's germane to the class. It'd be best if the faculty themselves are making these determinations. So it's a matter of university policy and how it's implemented and how we conceptualize it. The starting point ought to be, how do faculty think about this? And moreover, I think that's how judges ought to be thinking about it as well when they're trying to think about, okay, where's the standard come from for which I ought to be thinking about germaneness? Then they ought to be thinking, well, what would faculty think about this? But on the other hand, if you're constitutionalizing it, what it means in part is ultimately you're going to have to ask the judge, will you please strike down this action that the university has taken, whether it's public university officials or it's state legislatures and the like. And the judge is going to have to ask themselves, I would argue, in part, is this particular conversation germane to the content of the class? And ultimately, the judge is going to have to be the one who comes to their own conclusions about is it germane or not. And so there's a risk there of trying to go to judges in order to protect you to engage in academic freedom, because you're also leaving it in their hands to make that decision, which is not how we normally would want the university to operate. We prefer most of the time for these things to be done inside the university itself. And I think that becomes even more challenging and more relevant in relationship to the other prong that I think is really important to thinking about what the limitations of these academic freedom things are, which is to say professional competence. And so not only do we want to say, well, if you're speaking to your class and you're providing them with potentially controversial subject matter as part of the class, we want that controversial subject matter to be germane to the class and relevant to the class, but we also want it to be professionally competent material. That when the AUP says you have a right to teach and you ought to be free from university discipline for doing it, and you should be able to introduce controversial subject matters and materials as part of that teaching, the part of the background assumption that winds up getting articulated a bit later, but it's not entirely clear from the 1940 statement, it is actually clear in the 1950 Declaration of Principles, is, well, when you're introducing that controversial material, you have to adhere to disciplinary standards. So again, this is easiest to think of in the natural science context, but if you have somebody who is teaching astronomy and they're teaching their students that the sun revolves around the earth rather than vice versa, you would appropriately think the university should probably step in and try to address this problem because the professor is doing the wrong thing.
One would hope yet again.
One
yes.
would hope, right? And maybe even more concretely, right? If you're a civil engineering professor and you're teaching your students how to build bridges and you teach them so poorly that the bridge is going to fall down rather than stand up, the university has an interest in making sure, no, that education that we're offering the students needs to be professionally competent such that the bridges that get built are going to stand up, not fall down. Well, then the question is, okay, how do we know what's professionally competent? And especially once we move out into other disciplines outside, for example, the natural sciences, and we instead are thinking about disciplines like philosophy or English or political science or sociology
Yep.
and the like. And I think the core answer ultimately is going to be one of disciplinary colleagues. Do other people in the discipline accept this, what's being taught, no matter how controversial it might be, as within the bounds of what is professionally competent in your particular discipline? And again, I think that ought to be a standard by which if we're going to constitutionalize this, judges are trying to refer as well. So when judges are asked, for example, that the Florida State Legislature has said, well, there's certain ideas you can't promote in your classroom. Part of what judges should be asking themselves is, well, are those ideas that the state legislature says you can't promote in the classroom professionally competent and accepted ideas within the context of particular disciplines that are being taught? So within African American studies, for example, is this an idea that is professionally accepted and regarded as incompetent, even if it might be controversial? And if so, then maybe you have a First Amendment right to express those views in a state university classroom, even if the state legislature doesn't like it particularly. So I think then we have to think about the scope of academic freedom protections as having some bounds to them and some limits to them, because what we don't want to do is just, and we can't, I think, do consistent with the purposes of the university, is simply throw it open and say, well, professors get to say whatever they want to say. That if you've employed a professor and you stuck them in a classroom and made a bunch of students go take the class, then they just have a First Amendment right to spout off however they want for the next 50 minutes. And the university could never, under any circumstances, step in, unless, for example, they're engaged in speech that we think violates the First Amendment if it was said in the public square, which again, to go back to the Kansas example, is sort of what Kansas suggests about this health sports professor. So am I making threats against the students? Am I harassing the students? Or am I inciting violence in the classroom and the like? Those are extreme outer bounds, but I actually think it's quite reasonable for the university to say, we have more of an interest in what happens in the classroom than just the question of, are you threatening the students with violence? And among those interests are you actually teaching the subject matter you're supposed to be teaching? And are you doing so in a professionally competent way?
Yep. And going back to sort of your germaneness point about things that are just beyond subject matter, that if you are trying to create a climate in which students are receptive and open to thinking critically and new ideas and engaging with each other as honest interlocutors, creating that kind of hostile environment is not going to serve pedagogical purposes either, right? I mean, it's like, I would like to think that none of us would support that as an approach in the classroom, because that's not creating a space where people get educated. That's something else.
I think that's right. The challenge in part is also, again, trying to think about what counts as and
how do you judge that, and who judges it,
and who makes that call? How do you judge it? What's the rules here? And one of the challenges I think we see on university campuses now is we have developed relatively new anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, anti-bullying policies of various sorts, many of which, by their own explicit terms, apply to a classroom context or apply to faculty speech. And universities have not been very good at figuring out how do we reconcile those new policies with older policies protecting academic freedom in university classrooms. And part of what I want to borrow from in thinking about the book and thinking about some of these questions about divisive concepts and critical race theory and the like is exactly when courts have been called upon to think about these kinds of harassment cases. So among the things lower courts have had to grapple with over the last 30 years or so are cases in which the university officials have disciplined or fired professors for things they've done in the classroom. And the university officials say, well, what you've done in the classroom is create a hostile educational environment by the kind of content of what you've said. And professors say, I have a First Amendment right to say things in the classroom. And so they bring it to court and say, the university is violating my academic freedom and violating my First Amendment rights by punishing me for how I was conducting the class. And part of what courts have asked themselves when faced with those kinds of disputes is, I want to know the content of what you're saying. I want to know the context of what you're saying and how it fits into this educational environment. Is it educationally appropriate and justifiable for you to engage in it in this particular speech in the classroom? Is it germane to the content of what you're doing and the like? And it goes to a kind of professional competence about what you're doing as well. And so so we have, for example, cases in which professors were routinely telling lewd jokes in classes, for example, or even making racist comments. And we've had cases like that as well, where lots of racist comments are being made in the classroom. And what judges have sometimes been forced to do is trying to figure out, okay, can we distinguish between the racist comments, for example, and introducing materials some might regard as racist in the class,
Right.
because there are contexts in certain classes where materials that some would regard as racist are precisely part of the controversial materials you're trying to teach. And so how do we distinguish between materials that some people might regard as racist, or ideas that some might regard as racist, and directing racist comments to students, for example. And likewise, thinking about, is it acceptable to tell jokes to students in order to try to loosen them up and get everybody engaged and have a good educational environment? And can we distinguish that from, well, now you're telling jokes that are lewd. In fact, some people can't participate effectively in the context because of the way in which you're telling jokes or the kind of jokes you're telling specifically. And so again, there's going to be some real gray areas there, and they're going to be tricky. But I think some of what we have learned from thinking about some of those kinds of cases can be informative about how we ought to think about how this would work in the context of critical race theory and other kinds of things that legislatures might look at and say, well, I think that's controversial, and I think some students are going to be disturbed by that. And I think some students, in fact, are not going to be able to learn very effectively if they're put in a classroom which you're teaching them this kind of material, or you're advocating these kinds of ideas. I think we need to emphasize in university context that sometimes students are going to be in classrooms in which they're going to be exposed to ideas that they find disturbing. And it may, in fact, be difficult for them to accept those ideas or engage with those ideas in a serious fashion. But we need to be able to distinguish between those circumstances in which students are being confronted with ideas they don't like from circumstances in which students are being harassed or discriminated against or otherwise targeted and bullied. And again, those are very context-specific kinds of judgments, but we need the right principles and rules in place in order to try to arbitrate those kinds of cases. And it's notable that states like Florida and lots of other conservative states that are thinking about this kind of legislation are precisely leveraging the arguments and rhetoric surrounding hostile educational environments in order to talk about this kind of legislation. They just want to say, we're taking the natural next step that people have been taking for a long time when we've said you can't have a hostile educational environment. Students need to be able to come into a classroom and be able to learn. And legislatures want to get in on that game and say, I can identify some stuff that if you talk about in the classroom is going to create a hostile educational environment, and I want it out of those classrooms. And in a lot of those cases, professors say, wait a second, that's actually the content of my discipline. And so when legislatures look at what's being taught in some universities and said, well, you know, this settler colonialism stuff or these whiteness studies stuff or various other ideas strike legislatures as precisely the kind of thing that create hostile educational environments for a whole set of students. And so I think we want to be, as professors and educators, extremely cautious not to inadvertently open the door to saying, well, yeah, you know what, politicians should be able to tell us which ideas might create a hostile educational environment, and we're going to have this sweeping opening that they can take advantage of to exclude a lot of stuff from the classroom.
This feels loaded, but so how, knowing
everything about this is loaded.
It's all loaded, right? Thinking specifically about the Florida legislation, I have not been following the way it's moving through the courts.
Yeah.
I mean, how confident are you that the Florida court system is competent to actually engage in that kind of subtle, sophisticated, complicated kind of line walking and analysis?
I've
But
been
you can
characterized
tell
by
by the tone of my voice what
yeah,
my
exactly.
instinct is on
I'm going to
that.
characterize myself as cautiously optimistic about how this works. So it's now in the federal courts. So part of the good news is we're in federal court land rather than state court land, and I think federal courts actually are a little more sophisticated about how to think about these things in ways that probably will be helpful. And they don't have the kinds of immediate political pressures that state courts often have. Life tenure. They don't have the worry about elections the way state courts do, and the like, and those things are probably beneficial. And the downside of courts in general, including federal courts, on the other hand, is judges are familiar with the First Amendment and how it works in lots of other contexts. They aren't necessarily very familiar with the university educational environment and how that works. And so that can lead to two kinds of problems. One kind of problem is to imagine, why should professors get a free pass to do things their employer doesn't like? And we know lots of other contexts, including with government employees, in which if the government employer doesn't like it, they can punish the employee for doing it. And moreover, the court, since it said academic freedom is of interest to the First Amendment in the 1960s, has now developed out this elaborate what's called government employee doctrine that is concerned precisely with saying, well, what kind of speech rights do government employees have, not only outside the workplace, what they post on social media and the like, for example, but also inside the workplace. And the court in general has said, look, you can't have a government agency operate and perform its functions if a supervisor can't look over the work product of an employee and take adverse employment consequences against that employee, for example, including firing them because they don't like the work product. And the work product may involve lots of speech activities, including speech activities about matters of public concern. So you don't like the public policy proposals being drafted up in a memo by your employee, you can take action against that in a normal governmental workplace. So then the question is, are professors different in that regard? Are they special in some fashion? I think they are, because universities are different than other
Says
kinds
the
of
professor.
workplaces. Says the professor, right? But that's what Florida lawyers are arguing is, look, professors aren't different. They're just like everybody else. And if university presidents don't like the kind of stuff they're offering up in the classroom, they should be able to take exactly the same steps to intervene in that context that we would expect government employment supervisors to take steps in lots of other contexts as well. And so some judges, I think, are going to be very sympathetic to that notion, right? That state university professors are not special. They're just like every other state employee, and they can be managed and supervised by their employer, just like every other state employee can be. So that's one kind of problem you could imagine courts getting into, is not taking the academic freedom concern seriously, not thinking enough about why professors are different. The other kind of problem I think you can run into as well, it goes the other direction, which is to say, well, I know what the First Amendment looks like, and I know what kind of speech it protects, and so I'll just extend that to the classroom context. So if you tell me classroom speech is protected by the First Amendment because there's some kind of academic freedom interest, then I will ask questions like, well, have you engaged in a true threat in your classroom? Have you incited violence in your classroom? If the answer is no, then you're protected. And again, I think that runs into all the problems we just encountered. So the challenge is, how do you try to help guide judges through the complicated situation of faculty speech in classrooms, and try to think through, okay, what would the First Amendment look like if you establish a doctrinal framework that makes sense here? And part of the book is designed to help provide that kind of guidance and walk through. But I think judges could make a variety of errors as they try to grapple with what they're confronting now. And they're going to have to make some decisions about what to do about some of this kind of legislation. So I think as faculty, we want to provide them with some guidance to say, okay, how should you think about these problems in this context? And partially, we have 100 years of history in which we've been thinking about these problems in the context of academic freedom more broadly, that we can bring to bear to think about it in this particular case. It's Florida right now. It's the case that's making its way through the courts. It's most extended because the Florida was first, and the litigation began first. It's now in the federal circuit court in Florida. They've heard oral arguments, but have not issued an opinion yet. The next stop would be the U.S. Supreme Court after the circuit court in Florida makes its decisions. This U.S. Supreme Court is very First Amendment friendly in lots of ways across a whole range of cases. And so that's, I think, a reason for some optimism here. There are several former professors on the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think that can be helpful in this context. They appreciate what universities do and why they do it in this particular way, and are Warren Court era First Amendment doctrine that talks about academic freedom precisely came from former professors, as people like Harvard Law School professor Felix Frankfurter and Yale Law School professor William O. Douglas, who were then justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, and said, you know what professors say when they say controversial things is kind of important. We ought to protect it. And so I'm kind of optimistic, I think, that people like Elena Kagan and Amy Coney Barrett will likewise bring that kind of sensibility to bear and say, no, there's a real First Amendment interest here in what happens in the classroom. And moreover, that they have some sophistication about what that has to look like. And so you can tap into that and try to take advantage of it. But like I said, I think these issues are intrinsically complicated. And so the answers are not easy just from a pure legal perspective. And then you layer on the politics of our current situation and why we're fighting about this, which is the nature of controversial speech in general. But you can imagine all kinds of ways in which this goes sideways. So like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that courts will come to a reasonable conclusion about this, but you never know.
You are listening to the Public Policy Channel of the New Books Network, and we have been speaking with Keith Whittington, who is the author of You Can't Teach That, The Battle Over University Classrooms, New from Polity. Keith, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
Thanks, I appreciate it.